The air within the grand palaces of the Habsburgs was often thick with more than just rich tapestries and the scent of old wood. It was an atmosphere charged with ambition, whispered secrets, and the chilling chill of betrayal. For centuries, this family reigned over vast empires, stretching from the sunny plains of Spain to the icy peaks of the Alps. They were a dynasty of immense power, but beneath the glittering crowns and heavy robes lay a history as dark and twisted as any soap opera. These were not mere squabbles over tea sets or inheritance. These were profound breaches of trust, deep wounds inflicted by kin upon kin that altered the course of lives and empires alike. Prepare yourself for stories of fathers turning on sons, brothers abandoning brothers, and children defying their mothers in ways that sent shockwaves through the very foundations of Europe. The Habsburgs were masters of power, and sometimes the greatest dangers came from within their own bloodlines. These are the 5 most devastating betrayals that stained their illustrious name. Number 5. King Philip II of Spain and his half-brother Don John of Austria. The year was 1571. The Ottoman Empire, a colossal power from the east, threatened to overwhelm Christian Europe. At the heart of this looming conflict stood a figure of dashing charisma and military genius, Don John of Austria. He was the illegitimate half-brother of King Philip II of Spain, but his royal blood was undeniable. His connection to the formidable Emperor Charles V, their shared father, a bond of great consequence. Don John was born of Emperor Charles V and a German noblewoman, Barbara Blomberg. Though born out of wedlock, Don John was acknowledged by his powerful father and later by his half-brother Philip II. He was raised with care and given a proper education. His noble lineage recognized despite his birth circumstances. Philip II. The King of Spain was a man of meticulous detail, a quiet and severe ruler who preferred the solitude of his office at the Escorial Palace to the clamor of battlefields. Don John, in stark contrast, was a man of action, a natural leader with a magnetic presence. He possessed the fiery spirit and military prowess that had characterized his father. It was Don John, at the tender age of 24, who was chosen to lead the Holy League fleet against the Ottomans in the Battle of Lepanto. This was not a small engagement. It was a clash of civilizations, a fight for the very future of Europe. Don John rose to the challenge magnificently. His leadership was inspiring, his tactics brilliant. On October 7, 1571, the Christian forces achieved a decisive victory, crushing the Ottoman fleet and halting their advance into the Mediterranean. The Battle of Lepanto was hailed across Europe as a miracle, a testament to Don John's strategic genius and courage. The victory made Don John a legend, a hero celebrated in songs and poems. He had saved Europe, and his name was on every tongue. But this very glory, this widespread adoration, began to poison the relationship with his powerful half-brother, Philip II. Philip II, while publicly praising Don John, harbored a deep-seated unease. The king was a man who preferred to control every detail to keep all power centralized. Don John's independent spirit, his growing popularity, and his ambition, fueled by whispers from those who saw him as a potential king, were perceived by Philip II as a threat to his own unyielding authority. This subtle shift in Philip II's perception marked the beginning of a devastating betrayal. Philip II began to undermine Don John not with open conflict, but with a slow, suffocating process of withholding resources, delaying decisions, and assigning him to difficult, under-supported projects. Don John, eager for new challenges, next year proposed a grand plan to conquer North Africa. He dreamed of establishing a Christian kingdom there, a new crown for the Habsburgs. But Philip II, perhaps fearing Don John's ambition, perhaps simply distrusting his brother's grand visions, gave only lukewarm support. The North African expedition faltered due to a lack of royal commitment. The ultimate betrayal came with Don John's appointment as Governor-General of the Spanish Netherlands in 1576. This was a poisoned chalice. The Netherlands was in full revolt against Spanish rule. a complex and bloody conflict that had already drained Spain's coffers and military might for years. It was a region of fierce Protestant resistance, led by figures like William the Silent, who were determined to secure their independence. Philip II sent Don John to the Netherlands with grand instructions but meager resources. The king's goal seemed to be not to allow Don John to win glory, but to exhaust his spirit and perhaps diminish his reputation in an unwinnable war. Don John arrived in the Netherlands with his characteristic optimism. He attempted diplomacy, seeking a peaceful resolution. But the rebels were deeply entrenched. When peace talks failed, Don John was forced into military action. He faced a rebellion that was deeply rooted, financially supported by foreign powers, and fought by a people utterly determined to be free from Spanish rule and the Catholic Inquisition. Don John's requests for more troops, more money, and more supplies were consistently met with delays or outright refusals from Philip II's court. In Madrid, letters from Don John to his brother became increasingly desperate, pleading for the means to carry out the very task he had been assigned. Philip II, from the distance of his study, seemed content to watch his brother struggle to let the impossible task slowly wear him down. Don John's health began to decline under the immense pressure, the constant strain of command, without adequate support, and the crushing sense of abandonment by his own brother. He was isolated, surrounded by rebellion, and increasingly convinced that his plight was orchestrated by Philip II. He knew he was being sacrificed, his reputation, and even his life slowly being consumed by a conflict that his brother refused to properly fund or resolve. The harsh climate, the relentless fighting, and the pervasive feeling of being trapped in a losing battle with no way out finally took their toll. Don John of Austria fell ill with a fever, likely typhus, in his camp near Namur in October 1578. He was only 31 years old. He died. A hero who had delivered Europe from the Ottomans, but also a man betrayed and broken by the very brother who should have been his greatest ally. His death served Philip II's purposes perfectly. The popular, ambitious half-brother was gone, no longer a potential challenge to the king's absolute power. Don John's life ended far from the glory he once knew. Surrounded by the mud and misery of a war he could not win, sacrificed by a silent and unforgiving brother. It was a slow, deliberate form of destruction, a betrayal of blood and trust that left a permanent stain on the legacy of Philip II. Number 4. Emperor Franz Joseph I and his son, Crown Prince Rudolf. The relationship between Emperor Franz Joseph I and his only son, Crown Prince Rudolf, was a tragedy, years in the making, culminating in one of the most shocking events in Habsburg history. Franz Joseph was the embodiment of tradition, duty, and unwavering adherence to the past. He was a conservative ruler, meticulous in his routines, deeply devout, and utterly dedicated to preserving the ancient order of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. His son, Rudolf, born in 1858, was everything his father was not. Rudolf was brilliant, restless, liberal-minded, and intensely curious about the emerging scientific and political ideas of his time. He was drawn to progressive thought, fascinated by ornithology, and championed secularism and Hungarian autonomy, ideas that were anathema to his father's rigid court. From Rudolf's early childhood, the clash was evident. Franz Joseph insisted on a harsh military upbringing for his son, believing it would instill discipline and manliness. He appointed strict tutors who subjected young Rudolf to physical and emotional abuse, hoping to mold him into a carbon copy of the emperor. But instead of breaking Rudolf, this upbringing only fostered resentment and a deeper sense of alienation from his father. Rudolf found solace in intellectual pursuits, in writing, and in the company of liberal thinkers and journalists, individuals whom his father viewed with suspicion and disapproval. He wrote articles under pseudonyms criticizing the very empire he was destined to inherit, advocating for reforms that would have shocked the conservative establishment. The imperial court, a place of stifling etiquette and rigid hierarchy, offered Rudolf little comfort or purpose. His role as crown prince was largely ceremonial, with his father refusing to grant him any meaningful responsibility or insights into state affairs. Franz Joseph, perhaps fearing his son's progressive tendencies, kept Rudolf at arm's length, denying him the practical experience he would need to rule. This exclusion was a deep wound for Rudolf. He felt useless, trapped by his destiny, and increasingly isolated within his own family. He yearned for influence, for a chance to implement the changes he believed were necessary for the empire's survival, but his father kept him perpetually in the shadows. Rudolf's personal life also became a source of great sorrow and rebellion. His marriage in 1881 to Princess Stephanie of Belgium, though dynastically suitable, was unhappy. Rudolf sought comfort in other relationships, famously having many affairs. He struggled with depression, likely exacerbated by his father's distant and critical demeanor, the oppressive atmosphere of the court, and the feeling of utter powerlessness over his own future. He became increasingly cynical, his early idealism replaced by a brooding despair. He drank heavily, suffered from venereal diseases, and was addicted to morphine, a common painkiller at the time. These behaviors, while tragic, also represented a form of quiet defiance of the strict moral codes of his father's court. The betrayal here was not a single dramatic act, but a slow, agonizing abandonment of a son by his father. A kingly neglect that denied Rudolf purpose, understanding, and ultimately hope. Franz Joseph's inability or unwillingness to connect with his son, to understand his progressive views, or to give him any real responsibility, left Rudolf feeling cast adrift. The emperor's unwavering commitment to his own conservative world, his refusal to acknowledge the winds of change that Rudolf embodied effectively, alienated his only male heir. This constant criticism, this perpetual disapproval, chipped away at Rudolf's spirit, leaving him vulnerable and despairing. The culmination of this tragic relationship occurred on January 30th, 1889. At Merling, a secluded imperial hunting lodge. Rudolf, deeply troubled and increasingly desperate, had formed a secret relationship with a 17-year-old baroness named Mary Vetsura. She was young, spirited, and utterly devoted to Rudolf. Their bond, however, was illicit and dangerous. What exactly transpired at Merling remains shrouded in mystery, a scandal fiercely suppressed by the Habsburg court. The official story, quickly fabricated and enforced, was that Rudolf died of a heart attack. However, the truth whispered and eventually confirmed by later investigations was far more shocking. Crown Prince Rudolf and Mary Vetsura died in a suicide pact. Rudolf, consumed by despair, shot Mary Vetsura before turning the pistol on himself. The specific reasons for this ultimate act are debated by historians. Was it political pressure? His love affair being discovered and forbidden by his father? Was it his failing health, his addictions, or simply an overwhelming sense of meaninglessness? What is clear is that Rudolf, the man meant to inherit one of Europe's most powerful empires, felt so utterly hopeless, so completely betrayed by the lack of understanding and support from his family, particularly his father, that he chose to end his own life. Franz Joseph's reaction was one of profound grief, but also immediate damage. The scandal was too immense for the empire to bear. The truth was covered up with ruthless efficiency. Mary Vetsura's body was secretly buried, her existence virtually erased. Rudolf's suicide was officially declared an accident, then a heart attack, then eventually attributed to mental illness. The emperor, who had failed to connect with his living son, now tried to control his dead son's legacy, to minimize the catastrophic implications of his heir's desperate act. Rudolf's death devastated the imperial family and sent shockwaves across Europe. It left Franz Joseph without a direct male heir, destabilizing the future of the Habsburg monarchy. The profound and irreparable rift between father and son, born of differing philosophies and personal neglect, led to an ultimate act of despair that reverberated through the very heart of the empire, foreshadowing its eventual collapse. Just a few decades later, The betrayal was not a single knife thrust, but a slow, suffocating estrangement that cost an empire its future, and a father his only son. Number 3. Holy Roman Empress Maria Theresa and her son, Emperor Joseph II. Holy Roman Empress. Maria Theresa was one of the most formidable rulers in European history. She ascended to the Habsburg throne in 1740. A young woman facing a continent full of powerful male rulers who believed they could easily dismember her inheritance. Against all odds, she not only defended her vast lands, but transformed them, ushering in an era of sweeping reforms that modernized the Austrian Empire. She was a deeply religious woman, a devoted mother to 16 children, and a ruler who combined immense personal charm with an iron will. She oversaw improvements in the military, education, medicine, and the economy, shaping the Habsburg monarchy into a more centralized and efficient state. Her eldest son, Joseph, born in 1741, was destined to inherit her vast domains. From an early age, Joseph was intelligent, industrious, and possessed an intense desire to improve the world around him. However, his vision of improvement was often radically different from his mother's. Maria Theresa was a pragmatic reformer, implementing changes slowly and carefully, always mindful of tradition and the diverse customs of her many peoples. Joseph, on the other hand, was a passionate advocate for Enlightenment ideals. He was a true believer in absolute monarchy, but one guided by reason and dedicated to the welfare of its subjects, even if it meant overturning centuries of tradition and offending powerful groups. He admired the efficiency of the Prussian King Frederick the Great, a rival and enemy of his mother, and believed in sweeping immediate change. The dynamic between mother and son became increasingly strained as Joseph grew older. In 1765, after the death of her beloved husband, Emperor Francis I Stephen, Maria Theresa agreed to make Joseph co-regent, giving him the title of Holy Roman Emperor. This was a unique arrangement born out of Maria Theresa's desire to prepare her son for his eventual rule, but it quickly became a source of constant friction. Joseph, now emperor in his own right, though still beholden to his mother's ultimate authority over the hereditary lands, felt stifled. He yearned to implement his grand reforms, to abolish serfdom, to secularize church lands, to introduce religious tolerance, and to centralize power even further than his mother had dared. Maria Theresa, however, was still the supreme ruler of Austria-Hungary and Bohemia. She had her own ideas about the pace and extent of reform. She was cautious, conservative by comparison, and deeply suspicious of Joseph's radical tendencies and his anti-clerical views. She believed that too much change too quickly would destabilize the empire and alienate powerful nobles in the church. Joseph chafed under his mother's watchful eye, feeling that she constantly undermined his authority and prevented him from achieving his true potential as a ruler. He wrote letters filled with frustration, complaining about his mother's slowness, her attachment to old ways, and her perceived lack of trust in his judgment. The betrayal here was not a single dramatic act, but a sustained, relentless struggle for control and influence between a powerful mother and an equally determined son. It was a betrayal of expectations. Joseph felt betrayed by his mother's unwillingness to fully relinquish power and to allow him to govern according to his progressive principles. Maria Theresa, in turn, felt betrayed by Joseph's impatience, his disregard for her careful, gradual approach, and his constant undermining of her authority in the eyes of the court and her other children. He would often act behind her back, attempting to implement his ideas or issue decrees that she would then have to overturn or modify. One significant area of conflict was the role of the Catholic Church. Maria Theresa was a devout Catholic who believed the Church was a pillar of stability. Joseph, while Catholic, was a product of the Enlightenment. He saw the Church as too powerful, too wealthy, and too resistant to modernization. He sought to bring the Church under state control, to reduce the number of monasteries, and to introduce religious tolerance for Protestants and Jews, radical ideas that deeply troubled his mother. She saw his actions as a threat to the spiritual well-being of her people and a direct challenge to her own deeply held faith. Their arguments were legendary, often escalating into heated exchanges. Joseph would storm out of meetings frustrated by his mother's unwavering opposition. Maria Theresa would weep, convinced that her son was jeopardizing everything she had worked so hard to build. The court was often a tense place, caught between the two powerful wills. Other members of the family, including Joseph's siblings, were often put in difficult positions, trying to navigate the complex loyalties. Despite their deep disagreements, a strange respect, and perhaps even love, persisted between them. Maria Theresa knew Joseph was talented, and Joseph respected his mother's dedication. But their conflicting visions for the empire were irreconcilable. Maria Theresa desperately clung to her authority, believing her experience and caution were essential for the empire's survival. Joseph, convinced of his own intellectual superiority and the righteousness of his ideas, believed his mother was holding back progress. When Maria Theresa finally died in 1780, Joseph II became the sole ruler. He immediately unleashed a torrent of reforms, earning him the nickname the Revolutionary Emperor. He abolished serfdom, dissolved hundreds of monasteries, confiscated church property, established religious tolerance, centralized the administration, reformed the judicial system, and even attempted to regulate church services. These were sweeping changes, implemented with startling speed and often without sufficient preparation or consideration for their impact on ordinary people. In many ways, Joseph II systematically dismantled aspects of his mother's carefully constructed legacy, viewing her slower, more cautious approach as insufficient. He reversed some of her policies and accelerated others to a pace she would never have approved. His reforms, while well-intentioned, often backfired due to their rapid implementation and lack of popular support. He alienated the nobility, the church, and even many of the common people he sought to help. By the end of his reign, the empire was on the verge of revolt in several provinces, and his grand vision lay in ruins. Joseph II died in 1790, a broken and disillusioned man feeling that he had failed. His successor, his brother Leopold II, spent much of his short reign undoing many of Joseph's radical reforms, a clear sign of how detailizing they had been. The betrayal of Maria Theresa by Joseph was not malicious intent, but a profound disregard for her established order and careful progress. It was a son's unyielding belief in his own superiority, his impatience to tear down what his mother had painstakingly built, and his conviction that his vision was the only true path. He rejected her wisdom and her cautious approach, inadvertently undermining the very stability she had fought so hard to secure. The result was not just political chaos, but a deep personal tragedy for both a mother who saw her life's work challenged, and a son who, despite his brilliance, could not escape the shadow of his mother's legacy, nor ultimately fulfill his own. Number 2. Emperor Franz Joseph I and his brother, Emperor Maximilian I of Mexico. The story of Archduke Ferdinand Maximilian of Austria, the younger brother of Emperor Franz Joseph I, is one of the most heartbreaking tales of imperial ambition and devastating abandonment within the Habsburg family. Maximilian was a man of charm, artistic inclinations, and a romantic spirit. Unlike his stern, duty-bound elder brother Franz Joseph, Maximilian possessed a love for nature, the arts, and seafaring. He commanded the Austrian navy, indulged in botanical studies, and dreamt of grand adventures. He lived a relatively peaceful and privileged life with his wife, Princess Charlotte of Belgium, at their beautiful seaside castle, Miramar, overlooking the Adriatic Sea. Then came the year 1863, and with it, a proposition that would shatter his tranquil existence. The Crown of Mexico, France, under Emperor Napoleon III, had intervened in Mexico, hoping to establish a Latin American empire, friendly to French interests, and to recover debts. Napoleon III, keen to avoid the appearance of naked conquest, sought a European prince to rule this new empire. His choice fell upon Maximilian. For Maximilian, the offer was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. On one hand, it was a chance to escape his brother's shadow, to finally rule, to embark on the grand adventure he always craved. On the other hand, it was a treacherous undertaking. Mexico was unstable. Its Republican forces, led by Benito Juarez, were strong, and the French intervention was widely unpopular. Maximilian was not entirely naive. He understood the dangers. He hesitated. Here is where the betrayal by his brother, Emperor Franz Joseph I, began to unfold. Franz Joseph, consumed by his own imperial duties and the intricate politics of Europe, was initially cautious. He extracted a crucial condition. Maximilian had to formally renounce his rights to the Austro-Hungarian throne. This was a severe demand, effectively cutting Maximilian off from his dynastic lineage and ensuring he could never challenge Franz Joseph for the Habsburg crown should the succession falter. Maximilian, perhaps blinded by the allure of a throne or pressured by his wife Charlotte's fervent ambition, signed the renunciation of the rights of succession to the imperial throne of Austria at Miramar. This act severed his safety net, his connection to his powerful homeland, and ultimately left him isolated. Franz Joseph's actions, though seemingly pragmatic for dynastic stability, were also a profound act of familial abandonment. He allowed his romantic, perhaps naive brother to accept a throne that was inherently unstable, knowing full well the immense risks involved. He did not dissuade him with the full force of a concerned elder brother. Instead, he facilitated his departure by ensuring his own throne was secure. The renunciation meant that should Mexico fall apart, Maximilian would have no claim or refuge within his own family's empire. He was cut loose, sent to an uncertain fate with the blessings of his brother, but with no safety net. Maximilian and Charlotte arrived in Mexico in 1864, embarking on their grand imperial adventure. But from the start, the empire was a mirage. Maximilian found himself caught between the liberal and conservative factions of Mexico, unable to satisfy either. He was dependent on French troops for his authority, but even that support was precarious. As the American Civil War concluded in 1865, the United States, a staunch supporter of republicanism, began to pressure France to withdraw its troops from Mexico. The Monroe Doctrine, which warned European powers against intervention in the Americas, now had teeth. Napoleon III, facing domestic pressures and the looming threat of war in Europe with Prussia, made the decision to withdraw his forces from Mexico. He began to pull out French troops in late 1866. This decision was the ultimate betrayal for Maximilian. He had been installed by Napoleon III, relying entirely on French military might. Without it, his empire had no foundation. He was left stranded in a hostile land surrounded by Republican forces, determined to restore their elected government. Maximilian, now desperate, turned to his brother Franz Joseph for help. He sent urgent pleas to Vienna, begging for financial aid, for Austrian volunteers, for any form of support that might save his collapsing empire and his life. But Franz Joseph, ever the pragmatist, refused. Austria was embroiled in its own political challenges, reeling from its defeat by Prussia in the Austro-Prussian War of 1866. Franz Joseph saw no strategic advantage in rescuing Maximilian. He viewed Maximilian's Mexican venture as a lost cause, a folly that had nothing to do with the interests of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The renunciation Maximilian had signed years earlier now proved to be his undoing. He was no longer an Austrian archduke in the emperor's eyes, but merely the emperor of Mexico, a foreign entanglement. The refusal of aid was a devastating blow. It meant Maximilian was truly abandoned, left to face the wrath of the Mexican Republicans alone. His wife, Charlotte, traveled back to Europe in a desperate attempt to secure support from Napoleon III and even the Pope, but her pleas were ignored. The stress and rejection proved too much for her, and she suffered a complete mental breakdown, living out the rest of her long life in various European residences, afflicted by paranoia and delusions. Maximilian, despite the overwhelming odds, refused to abandon his supporters in Mexico. He was captured by Benito Juarez's forces in Querétaro in May 1867. There was an international outcry, pleas for his life from European monarchs, including Franz Joseph, but these were too little, too late. Juarez, determined to make a definitive statement against foreign intervention, refused clemency. On June 19, 1867, Emperor Maximilian I of Mexico was executed by firing squad alongside two of his Mexican generals. Franz Joseph was reportedly shocked and grieved by his brother's death, but his grief did not negate the fact that his actions, or rather his inactions, had contributed to Maximilian's tragic end. He had allowed his brother to go to a dangerous land, ensured he had no way back, and then, when the inevitable crisis came, refused to offer the very help that might have saved him. The betrayal was complete. A brother sent to his doom, abandoned by his own kin, dying far from home, all for the sake of another's political expediency and a king's cold calculation of dynastic security. Number 1. King Philip II of Spain and his son Don Carlos. The relationship between King Philip II of Spain and his only legitimate son, Don Carlos, was a chilling tale of suspicion, madness, and ultimate parental betrayal that ended in tragedy. Born in 1545, Don Carlos was the son of Philip II and his first wife, Maria Manuela of Portugal. His birth was difficult, and his mother died shortly after leaving Carlos, a fragile and often sickly child. He was born with a deformed spine and suffered from frequent fevers and intense headaches, likely due to the extensive inbreeding within the Habsburg family, a common practice at the time, to maintain royal bloodlines. These physical ailments were often accompanied by erratic and violent behavior. As he grew older, Don Carlos exhibited a deeply troubled personality. He was known for his fits of rage, his impulsiveness, and sometimes outright cruelty. There are accounts of him attacking servants, torturing animals, and even on one occasion trying to throw a page boy out of a window. His mental instability was a grave concern for the future of the vast Spanish Empire. In 1562, he suffered a severe head injury from a fall down a staircase, which may have further exacerbated his erratic behavior and mental health issues. Philip II, a meticulous, cautious, and deeply religious monarch, was the exact opposite of his volatile son. Philip was known for his stoicism, his commitment to duty, and his unwavering belief in divine right. He found his son's unpredictability and lack of self-control deeply disturbing as Don Carlos aged. His behavior became more brazen. He resented his father's distant nature and his lack of involvement in state affairs. He felt excluded, powerless, and trapped by his position as heir. He desperately wanted a role in governing, particularly in the administration of the Netherlands, where a rebellion against Spanish rule was brewing. Philip II, however, deemed Carlos too unstable and untrustworthy to be given such a critical assignment. This paternal distrust evolved into outright suspicion. Don Carlos, in his frustration, began to make rash statements, criticizing his father's policies, and even, it was rumored, plotting to flee to the Netherlands to join the rebels or to kill his father. He associated with disgruntled nobles and foreign envoys, further fueling Philip II's paranoia. Philip II was a man who saw conspiracies everywhere, and his own son's erratic behavior, combined with the whispers of a restless court, became undeniable proof of a perceived thrifty 68. Philip II, convinced that his son was plotting against him, or simply too dangerous to be left free, made a chilling decision. In the dead of night, King Philip II, accompanied by his guards and a few trusted advisors, entered Don Carlos's chambers in the Royal Alcazar of Madrid. They seized Don Carlos, disarmed him, and locked him in his room, boarding up the windows and changing the locks. Don Carlos was declared insane and a danger to the state. He was placed under strict house arrest, confined to a single room. This was not just an act of imprisonment. It was a father imprisoning his own flesh and blood, cutting him off entirely from the world, from hope, and from any chance of succession. Philip II's official justification was that Don Carlos was a lunatic who threatened the stability of the realm, but many wondered if it was simply a father's fear of a difficult heir. or a king's ruthless determination to eliminate any potential rival. Even his own son, Don Carlos's imprisonment, was harsh. He was denied visitors, allowed no books except religious texts, and fed irregularly. He grew increasingly desperate, at times refusing to eat, at other times overeating to the point of illness. His health, already fragile, deteriorated rapidly. The confinement, the lack of stimulation, and the despair plunged him deeper into madness. He would reportedly rave about his father, alternately cursing and pleading. The international community was shocked by this drastic act. Kings did not simply imprison their heirs, yet Philip II, with his characteristic cold determination, stood by his decision, claiming it was for the good of the kingdom and the salvation of his son's soul. Don Carlos died just 6 months later, in July 1568, at the age of 23. The official cause of death was illness, possibly due to his chronic health problems and the harsh conditions of his confinement. However, rumors immediately circulated that he had been poisoned or starved to death on his father's orders. While there is no definitive proof of direct murder, Philip II's decision to imprison his fragile and unstable son, and the conditions of that imprisonment, undeniably hastened Don Carlos's demise. The king's action was a death sentence, whether explicitly stated or not. The death of Don Carlos left Philip II without a male heir. For a time, a significant blow to the continuity of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty. He would later have a son, Philip III, with his fourth wife. But the stain of Don Carlos's imprisonment and mysterious death never truly left Philip II's reputation. This was the ultimate family betrayal, a father, the most powerful king in Europe, who stripped his own son of his freedom, his dignity, and ultimately his life, all to secure his own authority and protect his realm from a troubled and unpredictable heir. It was a cold, calculated act, devoid of paternal mercy, leaving behind a chilling legacy of a son consumed by his own demons and betrayed by the unyielding will of his father.